Hi guys, Randall here. Today we'll be talking about TMRs. I did a video on the topic a couple months ago, and the game has evolved so much since then that I feel like it's entirely worth revisiting. I won't be talking about every single TMR in the game, but rather I'll be focusing on the ones that I think have the most impact on play, and the ones that players should target to either obtain or should level because they have a much different performance from level 1 to level 20. Something every player should be aware of is when leveling TMRs, you get diminishing returns the higher the level you get. It's just like leveling limit bursts, which means that getting from level 1 to level 10 is basically free. 1 to 15 costs you 115 king pots worth of experience, but getting to level 15 to 20 costs you even more than getting from 1 to 15. So it gets more and more expensive as you go. So for a lot of pieces of gear, if you don't need the entirety of the bonus and you're on a budget regarding your armor pots, then you can consider just taking these to 15 and stopping there. It's what I do with a lot of my limit bursts. And then for TMRs, the ones that I bring almost every time I use a TMR, I will level to 20, but the ones that I only need for a niche build and I'm only going to use once in a while, I typically leave at level 15, and I find that this has been fine for me. Let's begin with the most obvious category, the AP Restore items. I think every player should aim to get Xyz's Bells and max this at level 20. It's an item that is really a staple in War of the Visions. Could be for Raid, for PvP, for PvE. It's seen everywhere, and it is very, very good. And then all the other options that give you AP give you significantly less. There's Lucio's TMR that was just handed to basically every player if you're able to complete his quest, which gives you a whole 10% when max. So it goes from 5 to 10%. Xyz's Bells, as a reference, begins at 10% and finishes at 25. So it's a really big difference. I think Lucio's TMR is a great option if you don't own any of the others, but I feel like the others, even though they give less AP, have something else on top, which makes them more worth it. Noctis's clothing, if you own them, give you Protect on top of the 5%, but they're limited to the clothing slot, so they take your armor piece of equipment, and then you can't equip them on every single item, because if your unit's a heavy armor user, they will not be able to wear this. Oldoa's Apron is also very job limited, not everybody can wear it, but it gives you 5% AP refresh and 50% defense penetration, which can be very impressive. I think both Noctis's clothing and Oldoa's Apron are very worth having if you have access to those units, but otherwise you could very well do with Lucio's TMR as a second item. I find that having 2 AP refresh pieces of gear is enough. I really don't feel like running 3 different pieces of AP restore gear across your team is more often than not, I'll want another type of TMR that gives me a different type of bonus that I need for my team. And so 2 is enough. Just pick the 2 that you like the most and go ahead with that. Another piece of gear that is not a percentage refresh over 3 turns, but rather just a flat amount of AP is Summerkill Phase Scarf that we have at the right on the screen. This is a really impressive piece of gear. You get 20 AP, you can cast this twice, and you get Shell for 3 turns when you activate it. And then the stats are very good. Again, it's job limited, even though it's an accessory, but for those jobs that can use it, I've found that this was actually a much better option than Lucio's TMR, for example, because yes, you get less AP overall, but the survivability you gain and the stats that the item have makes it a very competitive option. And then, I don't know if players are aware of this, but AP Restored given by a TMR like this is not affected by Acquired AP Up. So Acquired AP Up will only increase the AP you get with your basic attacks and by spending TP. It will not influence any TP you gain from an ability that gives you an amount of AP, because it's considered Restored AP and not Acquired AP. So yeah, just keep that in mind when you equip those items. Now, on to the other categories. I think there's 3 TMRs in the game that are so good and so game-changing that they are actually worth pulling a unit for. 2 of them are regarding time-limited units, unfortunately. The first one is Kane's TMR. Kane is going to get a rerun shortly with the Final Fantasy IV collaboration, and, well, there's a lot of really good units coming up in the future. I, myself, am still considering whether it's worth it spending Viz to get Kane just to get his TMR, but for players that do own this TMR, it is a completely insane piece of gear, both for manual and auto play, that is really hard to beat. Its ability gives you haste and an extra square of movement for 3 turns, and it can be used twice in a fight. That's insane. On my side, on manual play, this has been a staple. Whenever a player owns it, I typically see them run it, because being able to move faster and get your turn quicker together in a single ability is just crazy. And then the fact that it typically haste is something that you have to bring a time mage for, and it has a cast time. This is an instant speed haste. It's really, really good. It is a helmet, so you're limited on who can use this, but guess what? Scarlet Elna, among other things, can wear helmets. So yeah, just a very impressive piece of gear, and you guys should consider whether Kayn is worth it just for this piece of gear if you're into competitive gameplay. The second one is Halloween Rare Use TMR, the Zombie Mask. I'm sure most players know of this item that gives you re-raise as a TMR ability. I have gone to pity on the latest Halloween Rare Use banner just for this item, because there are a lot of class matches that would come down to who owns this item, and I've had one class match season since then, and because I had this item, I was able to win 2 or 3 matches that were very, very close, and it basically came down to I had re-raised, the enemy team did not, I won. So it's one of those really game-changing TMRs that you can't really do without. And then the third one is Rob's TMR, which is the Glinting Armor, and it provides you with Keenblade, which is a very infamous ability. It's used for cheese builds in a lot of scenarios, but I find that it's also really useful for a lot of PvE scenarios, or for selection quests and etc. When you have to build a chain on people, being able to give half a turn up on everybody on your team is crazy good, and then it gives you slash attack as well. And then yes, if you're playing something like manual PvP or even in auto PvP and you want to set up your early turns in a specific way, this CT manipulation tool is incredibly good. So I think players should aim to build their Rob the second they get them, put them in the hard quest list that they have on a daily basis. Even if they don't want to use the unit, get Rob to 99, get that TMR, it is game changing. Now here's a second category of items that I think are extremely impactful, and I'm going to talk about the barrier TMRs. I think, considering that Machery can be obtained by friend medals and can be maxed just like Ziza via friend medals, every player should aim to get the Knight's Blessing, well, the Steel Maiden's Necklace, the first one on top, which is Machery's TMR. This gives the unit that wears it an ability to give everybody around themselves a 30% barrier for 3 hits. It covers both physical and magical, and it heals you with a Kiraga level heal for everybody in the area. Not every unit has an AI that's going to prioritize this move, but if you equip this on a healer, I love to do this on Freyevia or somebody like Aerith, they are going to use this before any other heal typically, and this means that not only are they bringing everybody back to high HP, they also give them a barrier on top. For manual play, this is a staple. Players typically run this in one of their 3 characters just to have that 30% barrier on everyone, where they're going to use this early in the match and make sure they tank an extra hit before going down. But even in auto, I've been able to use this in a lot of scenarios, and in selection quests and other content for PvE that is very highly difficult, being able to put a barrier on everyone on my team has been an extremely efficient strategy. So I think players should aim for this. It doesn't cost you any viz to get it, so just slowly go for that with your friend points, and it is going to be worth it. Then I see Black Rose Helena's TMR have a lot of play. I think for those players that do not own Zombie Rare Use TMR, instead of equipping the re-raise, if you're using this on a mage because it's only equipable by mages, you put this piece of gear, it gives you good stats, it has some agility in there and some extra magic, and then it gives a barrier for the unit that uses it. For units like Halloween Little Leela or Black Rose or Ibarra, it is a great piece of gear, and if you don't own the re-raise TMR, I think it's the next best thing. And then there's also Yuna's TMR. Unlike the other 2, it's a piece of clothing, so you can't equip this on everyone, but it gives you the same type of healing as Machery's Necklace, and then gives you Protect and Shell for 3 turns. Initially, when they were both available and Yuna was just released, I valued the shield from Machery's TMR much higher than I valued the Protect and Shell, because I figured 30% was better than 25%, and 3 hits was covering you for roughly the same amount of time. But now there's a lot of units with multi-hit attacks that are going to just do a 4-hit chain on you immediately, like Starlet Elena, and so they break the barrier you have very quickly. Now, I think if you have the option to run both, if your unit can equip clothing, it's actually better to have something like Small Practice, because the Protect and Shell will cover you for a much longer amount of time than what 3 hits can do for you. Now, let's talk about accuracy up TMRs. I think after you're done with covering your barrier needs and you have the most strong pieces of TMR, there is one more that every player should aim to get, and it is the Sage Barret, Luel's TMR. Actually, if you're a light spender or any kind of spender and you don't own Luel or her TMR, I think it's worth it to get a unit of choice ticket just to get her and get that TMR. It is one of those game-changing pieces of gear, in my opinion, and you'll see that it's at the top of the chart for me for accuracy, evasion, and status effect prevention. It's just that good. It, in an AoE, gives a luck-up buff of 35%. Now, there's no other source of luck-up buff in the game on field, as far as I know right now. And then on top of that, it prevents blind and stop for everybody that's targeted for those turns. So if you're fighting a team that has stop-oriented strategy, maybe EX Agrias one day, this is going to be very important. And then having some extra luck increases all your units' accuracy and evasion together, so it's both good for those types of builds. There's a bunch of other accessories and items you can have for accuracy. Yerma's TMR, even unleveled, gives you 30 accuracy for 3 turns for the unit that uses it and some extra attack. But the issue I have with that is that it's a piece of clothing, so it takes your armor slot, and not everybody can use that. There's 2 good accessories, though, that everybody can use. Elsirel's TMR gives you 30 accuracy in an AoE. I find that often, if I need an ability to give me accuracy, it's more efficient to bring someone like Nines or Winter Duartha, someone that has an innate accuracy buff, because they typically give accuracy and something else, while Elsirel's TMR just gives you accuracy. So if your team really needs it, you can use that, but otherwise I think I prefer bringing a teammate or just using the Sage's Barret that will give me much more than just accuracy. But it is there if you don't own Luelle and you don't want to pull her just for the TMR. You could go for Elsirel's TMR, which is the next best thing. And then Raldor's TMR is only a single target, so it's not going to increase your entire team, but if you only have one person that needs to do the damage on your team, or there's only one of your characters that's inaccurate, you could go for Raldor's TMR. It gives you 30 accuracy for 3 turns when you use it and it's maxed, and then gives you an extra square of movement on top. So it's not as wide in an area, but you get extra movement instead. So I think that kind of makes up for the single target buff. Now, what about Evasion? I did talk about the Sage's Barret. It is still the best one, and you want this over anything else. But if you have slot for another piece of gear that's Evasion related, you could use the V-Clan Mask Nivlu's TMR. The issue I have with this is it's only equipable by ranged attackers, so your character has to be a sniper or a ranger or a gunner to be able to even use this. But when they do, it's a very large AoE in which they give evasion up 30 for 3 turns. There are a bunch of evasion units that don't have innate evasion up buffs, or that you want to prioritize other buffs. So for example, if you were running Starlet Elena and you were running her in a way that she uses TMRs first and then Courage and then runs into the fight, she likely doesn't have time to use her evasion up buff on top. So you could have somebody like Fina use Inherited Bewitching Art first and then give her an evasion up 30 still. And that can be a pretty good strategy. I've used it in the past and it works well, but it requires very serious team tweaking because it's so job limited. And then this is also one of those TMRs that you need to have maxed because it ranges from 10 to 30. So the difference, every level you give it gives you +1 evasion. So unless you have it at least 15, you're not getting a lot of value out of it. Now onto status prevention TMRs. I find that these are not extremely useful in a lot of auto PvP. So if you're thinking guild battle or arena, it's often not necessary, but when you're playing manually, players rely on status effects a lot more, and there are a lot of strategies that just revolve around not making you unable to play, and these are a staple in just making sure your team does not get disrupted. It's also useful in a lot of PvE scenarios where there are some levels where enemies will just spam stop on you or spam disable on you, or every single enemy has a different status effect and they're coming at you with those, and having ways to prevent status effects are very important. Especially for PvE, you have access to 5 different TMRs. It is possible to bring 1 or 2 of these, the most critical ones, and still have bells and a bunch of other TMRs to use. I really love Luelle's TMR, again, Nullify Blinds, but mostly Stop, and it's the only TMR, as far as I know, that prevents Stop, so that's very, very good. If you own Summer Catone, you have access to an area buff that prevents Silence, Charm, and Immobilize. If you have 9S, you have his TMR that prevents Sleep, Confusion, and Charm, so another way to prevent Charm. And then Confusion can be a nice little buff. And then if you're fighting enemy King Mons and people that love to Berserk, you can use Mor's TMR, the Starry Veil, at the bottom, which gives you extra spirit in an AoE, which is good for magic survivability, but also nullifies Sleep, Slow, and Berserk. There's also Frederica's TMR at the top left, but it is only single target, so it's a lot weaker than all the other options. It does prevent those Stop, Immobilize, and Disable. And then there is also Minwoo's TMR, the Fire Selection Quest unit, which provides you with an AoE Confusion, Disable, and Stun nullification. I don't think it's as good as the others. Disable is quite annoying, but it's not as bad as Charm or Stop. It's really the two statuses that I think players should aim to prevent the most. And then Berserk is among these that just make you straight up lose the game. So now I think we've covered the most important categories. The other TMRs I'll talk about are really nice to have, but I think you should aim to get that King Rob's TMR, that Luel's TMR, and that Mashari's TMR probably before anything else. But then there's a bunch of good options for team survivability as well. King Mon's TMR, I mean, if you own King Mon, you probably want to max him as soon as you can. He is a fantastic tank, and his TMR is also really good. It provides you with an AoE resistance buff of 25 for 3 turns. Now, AoE TMRs and TMRs with AoE buffs in general can change your team's AI as well, because units will typically use AoE buffs before single target buffs, and if you're running a unit that doesn't have an AoE buff, they'll typically just run towards the middle, towards the enemy team very early on, and putting that kind of item on them can make sure they stay behind a little bit longer. But just the buff itself, AoE resistance, is extremely valuable. It protects your team against large attacks that are going to hit everybody, and these just end up dealing less damage. I value this a lot higher than I would Aerith's TMR, which provides you with the same buff, but in single target resistance instead, just because enemy team is going to be like, okay, I'm going to AoE you down. Whereas if you have AoE resistance, they're left with a difficult choice. Either they hit several people with less damage, or they just choose a single target ability. And in both scenarios, you win. Then Starlet Elena's TMR is really just good to fight teams with an enemy Starlet Elena, right? It's good against other light teams because you get that light resistance up 20% and then some slash attack for herself. I see a lot of light versus light teams that use this TMR, and it has had very high value. It's often the difference between going down in 1 hit or 2 hit when you have the buff up. Another good TMR for magic survivability is Rain's TMR if you own it, because it gives you a 25 extra spirit in a large AoE. Now, Mor's TMR gives you 15 spirit. I know there's Velric TMRs that gives you 15 defense, and these are all pretty good, but 25 is just such a high amount that with that, it's super easy to have characters that have over 50 spirit for 3 turns and just tank hits that they would otherwise die to. So it's one I value very highly. Now, there's also a bunch of TMRs that I love to use for PvE stages. They're not meant for PvP, I think, but they provide offensive boosts, and often when raiding or when doing a Bucks event where overkilling an enemy is important, these will be quite handy. So they're not a priority. I think no account should focus on those first, but if you do own them and you have the spare armor pots to level them, they're all pretty good pieces of gear to have. Miranda's TMR, the Red Jacket, provides you with an AoE, magic attack, and slash attack buff. Almost all units nowadays, if they're attackers, have ways to increase their attack or magic, so I find that these buffs are often redundant, but extra slash attack or magic attack is something that not everybody has, and then that typically covers the 2 most common damage types in the game, so it's pretty easy to increase your entire team's offense if you're running one of those strategies. Then Miranda's TMR, the Kaleido Moon item, provides you with extra attack and magic, but also acquired AP up 50% for 3 turns. If your unit is not using bells or some other form of AP refresh, this allows them to spam their abilities a lot more than they otherwise would, and I think it's a pretty good alternative. If you already have bells on some people and you need some more AP on your team, this is a good piece of gear to have. And then Sissel's TMR, the Saint's Circlet, is another alternative for attack up and magic up 30%. I don't think it's that incredible. Again, lots of units have those buffs now innately in their kit, but it increases your bravery in an AoE, which is really useful for bravery farming. I wish I leveled Sissel to 99 just to get this. My Sissel is 89, and every single time I have to farm for bravery, I'm like, ugh. Can't wait for his rerun to max him, which I will do the second FF4 comes back. So yeah, when Final Fantasy IV hits, I think it's worth the investment getting your Cecil to 99 just to be able to farm bravery a lot easier. The difference is, if you're using the meditation strategy from Samurai, you have to manually do it because the AI will not use meditation ever. Whereas this, since it gives other stuff than just bravery, the AI will actually use, and you can just leave your team on auto and have bravery maxed after a while when you come back to your phone. So it's pretty useful. Another category I think is worth covering is a bunch of TMRs that give you individual survivability. They're just going to make the unit that used the buff more tanky, and it's typically something I would equip on tank. If you own Agrias, her TMR gives you Protect and Shell for 3 turns. Initially, a while back, I thought this was pretty bad. I would think just put a barrier on yourself, and it will provide you with more overall survivability. But now there's a lot of units with barrier breaks or super high chains that are going to burst through your barrier very quickly, and over the course of 3 turns, a Protect and Shell is likely to save you more HP than anything else. So I'm starting to think this has really high value nowadays because of the way the game has shifted. It does take your armor slots, so you're probably not going to be able to equip one of those +5 pieces of gear from Raid, which is a high cost, but if you feel like Protect and Shell has really high value, I feel like this can be a very good piece of gear. Also, even better maybe because it's an accessory. Joom's accessory, if you own her, gives you defense and spirit up 20 for 3 turns. On a unit like Kingmont or Joom that already goes into the fight with 60 defense, this is crazy. It gives you a much thinner gap in which enemies can deal physical damage to you unless they have a lot of defense penetration. So these are both very good. There's also Whisper's TMR, which gives you 45 defense and spirit for 1 single turn. So it's really interesting because you can make builds where you're basically immune to damage for 1 turn if the enemy does not have the right penetrations, but it's such a short duration that I don't feel like it has a lot of value compared to those others that I have on screen. Then finally, I've got 6 other TMRs that are just out of these categories, but are still very, very good. Velric's TMR gives you an AoE buff of 15 defense and some bravery up. If you have Velric's TMR, you do not need to level Cecil's. This will cover you just fine. And then on top of that, it's a 15 extra defense, which could be relevant in some builds. Catone's TMR, if you own her, you don't need to level it. You get basically nothing by leveling it, moving the hate down from 6 to 8. Nobody uses this for the hate down. It's used for the extra move and jump, and as this, it's an incredibly good piece of gear. For a lot of PvP, manual PvP, it's really important to make your unit move right. Sometimes in auto PvP, you will need this on a unit to make them have the right movement as well. And then in a lot of PvE stages, it can be used to go up, hit somebody, and then get out of their range. There's a lot of utility for extra mobility in a game like this. So yeah, Catone, getting her to 99 is very much worth it. Like a lot of other units, she is available. I believe Catone is through friend points, if not its guild points. But yeah, you should aim to build her just for that TMR, if not getting her to 120. Garvel's TMR is a very unique piece of gear. It gives you 40% magic and 50% magic resistance penetration for 3 turns, for units that only have a single damage type and can only deal magic damage, like Black Rose Helena for example, unless you're equipping the Spellblade subjob. This is a crazy good piece of gear because it's your way to make sure nobody can mitigate that, your damage through magic resistance. I see that now this TMR is losing value because there has been a couple other units with ways to either decrease magic resistance, like Regalia Glaciala, or units that innately have good magic resistance penetration. Black Witch Helena has a little bit of it. She has the Cypress Spell that can give her more. Eventually there's going to be other units released with magic resistance penetration. But for those units that don't have any, this is a crazy good piece of gear to have, just for those scenarios where you're fighting an enemy with very high magic resistance. And then finally, another batch of rather niche item is MR Solier's TMR. For some reason, this piece of gear gives you Human Killer 20 for magical scaling attacks for self. If you don't need a TMR with an active ability and you're a mage, this gives you a lot more damage than people think. And more often than not, I love running something like this if my strategy revolves on the unit using their init kit, just because it's a batch of extra damage you can equip in a TMR slot, which has a lot of value. Summer Lilith's TMR, if you own her, is the only item in the game, and the only way in the game right now to have a range up 2 buff. So it's 1 more range than anything else could give you, which sometimes is just that extra square you need to stay safe while hitting the enemy team. I like it a lot. And then finally, Elday's TMR, the King's Command, gives you 35% HP and an AoE for 3 turns, which is not that great in most scenarios, but the item itself has 15 evasion, and in Drainforce builds, it gives you both evasion and HP, which is what you want for a Drainforce Catone. So that can be a very interesting piece of gear for her. I've seen some people run it successfully, but it's been largely ignored because it requires you to build Elday, which is not a very popular character to get it. And then finally, a note on weapon TMRs. I don't have a slide for that. I don't value weapon TMRs highly. I know a lot of MR units give weapons that have status effects, and some players love to run them. I see some Engelberts with the Gafgarian sword, for example, that's going to sometimes, when they basic attack you, land a confusion status. I find that these are so unreliable that unless you're equipping them because you have nothing else to equip on your unit, they're not that necessary. The only item I value still somewhat highly is Dario's sword because it gives you acquired AP up 30, and for some paladins it's necessary to throw out Tonic Blade early, but nowadays most meta tanks have hate innately or have TP skills that give them hate, and so this is not even necessary anymore. So weapon TMRs and MR TMRs in general I think have a lot less value than they used to have, and I would not bother trying to get them. So this is going to be it. Even though I wanted this to be fairly short, there's just so much stuff to cover for TMRs that it had to have a certain length. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'd be curious, what TMRs do you guys use a lot that I did not name? Am I missing out on something huge? Let me know. And then that's it. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.